Okay, we're good.
Okay. Hi, my name is Sean Cotter. I'm the executive director for Wicked Queer, and I'm here with the director of Queer Japan, Graham Kolbeins. Graham, thank you for coming and joining us. And
Thanks for having me.
yeah, and sort of exciting to see your film. I feel like we've been talking about programming your films, since like December or so. So I'm glad actually we can finally share it with our queer audiences. And if you haven't seen Queer Japan yet, please, it's still available till Sunday night at 11 p.m. So please tune into our Zerb TV channel and check it out. So Graham, I guess to start out with, my first question for you would be, it's a wonderful sort of like comprehensive, I feel like, and very well organized documentary of a lot of information. And how did the project come about?
Thank you for saying that it's well organized. I felt like I was going crazy during the final stages of editing when there were just all these pieces, and then we had to figure out how to fit them in the right order. But I think it kind of worked out by the end after a number of cuts. And so it just started through all of this work that I had been doing with Japanese gay manga artists. I co-founded this brand called Massive Goods with Anne Ishii, who's my co-writer on Queer Japan. And the two of us, along with Chip Kidd, had been editing and producing these English language translations of Japanese gay manga for a number of years. And I'd been traveling to Japan and getting to know Gengaro Tagame, who's one of the central figures in the film, along with a number of other gay manga artists, right? So over all those trips, I just kept getting more and more interested in just how diverse and thriving queer culture was in Japan, and how much interesting history there was behind contemporary queer culture. So I proposed a grant to the Japan-US Friendship Commission. It's this binational organization that's funded by the NEA and Japan's cultural Agency for Cultural Affairs. And so the grant was successful, and in 2016 I got to go shoot this documentary for 5 months and just try to get as many interviews with amazing queer people who wanted to be in this film as possible.
That's awesome. So one thing I wanted to ask, sort of to bring on that, is maybe give us a little bit of history of what sort of the LGBT struggle, or sort of what rights, as it kind of maybe before your film on up, if you could, maybe some history of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. There are parallel but very separate trajectories to sort of the formation of contemporary LGBTQ identity in Japan. You could go back as far as the Edo period in the 1400s, 1500s. There were a lot of displays of alternate modes of sexuality that were kind of just integrated into the culture. And because it wasn't, Japan is not a Christian nation, it doesn't have that sort of Old Testament, gay equals bad history the way that a lot of European countries do. So it wasn't until the mid-1800s in the Meiji Restoration when Japan was basically forced to open its doors to trade with the West at the end of an American gunboat. So the traditions that were seen as too exotic and weird by foreigners were suddenly swept under the rug in the name of modernization during this very rapid period of transformation in the late 1800s. So basically, until that point, there had never really been a law against homosexuality that had really stuck. There maybe had been some local statutes, but in the late 1800s, the there were all of these laws imported from like Napoleonic France. So along with that, they imported the criminalization of homosexuality for about 10 years. And then people were like, never mind, actually, this isn't for us. So they decriminalized homosexuality in like the 1880s, I think. And since then, it's been kind of like varying degrees of stigma that have been repressing members of the queer community, but not so much the law itself. Other than, you know, gay marriage isn't legal. There isn't any discrimination protections in current Japan, at least on the national level. There are local statutes, but so in terms of those laws, Japanese the Japanese legal system is sort of lagging behind Western compatriots, as others said in the film. But yeah, at the same time, like in the 1950s and 60s, there was this flourishing of gay culture because it wasn't illegal. It was talked about a lot more in the press. The word gay came into sort of the Japanese lexicon in the 1950s before it was even really used widely in America. So gay bars started to get written about in the newspapers, and then this like new sensation of gay boys. So it kind of like allowed this culture to flourish, even though it wasn't in the mainstream, and it was still something that you had to sort of hide from your family and employer for a long time. And then in the early 1990s, during the HIV/AIDS epidemic, that's when a new sort of like LGBT activism took root in Japan. And people started organizing and asking for rights and demanding their rights. So it's kind of interesting, like while the post-Stonewall movement in America was really like flaring up in the 70s, there wasn't the equivalent sort of like political consciousness of LGBT identity or just gay identity in Japan until HIV/AIDS came along.
People had to fight for their rights because everyone was dying around them. So, I mean, you know, HIV was definitely politicized here, and you know, made people stand up and kind of fight for new rights and stuff like that.
Yeah, and it was the case too that the Japanese government was sort of scapegoating the gay community when HIV first popped up in the 90s. So they weren't reporting accurate figures, and they were saying this is just a gay disease. Many of the same things that we saw with the Reagan administration in America. So yeah, it kind of forced a new political consciousness.
Well, I mean, I'm for taking to the streets at every rate, anyways. So is now gay marriage is not legal still in Japan at all, is it?
There are municipalities where the same-sex partnership certificate has been adopted as sort of like an interim step. So I think it first started in 2013 or 2014. A couple of wards in Tokyo, Shibuya Ward and Setagaya Ward, were the first to introduce this partnership program for gays and lesbians. And it has since spread to a few dozen cities and municipalities around Japan. So there is progress, and it's not perfect. You know, a partnership certificate is supposed to be respected by landlords and businesses, but it's not enforced the same way that marriage is. So unfortunately, there's a very conservative political party, they're called the Liberal Democratic Party, and they've been running Japan for most of the last 2 decades. And the Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, is just very hardline. No, our constitution does not allow same-sex marriage. So there seems to be little traction on it becoming a national policy.
Well, hopefully that will change at some point more, because I mean, you did kind of capture some of the protesting of. Was that who you featured to the woman who's sort of speaking about? I forget. I'm losing her name right now. About sort of the homosexuality being taught in schools. Yeah, I was like, wow. But you know, it echoes of the U.S. and sort of you know, that sort of same stigma is like, you know, keep your gays away from the children, you know, because we do recruit and
Right. There's like this. So the film does depict a far right politician who is against any kind of like LGBT education and trying to like do anything about the statistics that LGBT youth are much more likely to commit suicide or self-harm. She kind of laughs it off. And even though she's like sort of a fringe extremist member of her party, that's the ruling party that she's in, and they only do so much to sort of like speak out against that kind of homophobia. So it's kind of like how I mean, well, in America now, Trump is like the most extreme and he's like at the center of the right-wing party, but I guess during like the Bush era, he was kind of like a more conservative Republican, and then there were crazier people with crazier views in Congress. So
most definitely. So how did you find your subjects of, and were there any of people that you filmed, any interviews that you really loved and wanted to put in but didn't quite make the cut?
Yeah, it was challenging. I shot over 100 interviews, so there were a lot of things that I wish I could have included, but we had to make it a feature film without making audiences sit for longer than 2 hours. Is usually like a thing that I try to follow. So, I mean, I like long things too, but for theatrical purposes, it's kind of hard to sit in a theater for much longer than that. Anyway, sorry, going off on a tangent. There were a lot of great interviews I didn't get to include. There's a flash of this in one of the montages, but there's this really cool party that was happening in Shinjuku Nishome at the time that was like Fundoshi J-pop night. And it was basically like mostly kind of like chubbier types. The word bear is sometimes used in Japan, but then there are other terms. So gachi muchi is like muscle curvy. And so there were like a lot of gachi muchi types who would go wear fundoshi to the bar. And fundoshi are these like traditional thongs, basically, or not, they're loincloths. And it's a pretty like fun, sexy garment. And this party was bringing it back into this like 21st century context of a J-pop party. So like they would have people go on stage and do lip sync performances to songs by Perfume or Pyari Pamu Pamu or one of these other groups that are like big in the gay community, all of our divas who we stand. So that was a really fun event, and unfortunately couldn't fit the interview in. But yeah, there were a lot of other things. I got to do a tour of Shinjuku Nichome with Vivian Sato, who's one of the first drag queens that we meet in the film, and she's kind of like one of the voices of the film. So that got into
really amazing too.
Yeah, she's amazing. I love what she says at the end of the film. Like, I asked a lot of the main cast about their opinions of where politics were going, and she was just like, I think that's the wrong question. You're asking like a patriarchal question, and we need to get rid of these old modes of patriarchy and just like have feminine power. And I was like, yes, that. So yeah, she's amazing. Hopefully I'll get to release some of these like deleted scenes on YouTube when the film comes out for the general release.
Nice. So when are you planning on doing a general release? That was also one of my questions.
Hopefully early 2021. It's kind of hard to say with how things are going right now. Like, but we're still hoping to show it in some theaters and then do a digital release afterwards. So keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think I mean it's like I said, it's a really wonderful, like super comprehensive. Like you put so much in there, but it's organized so well that it's not overwhelming. Like it could be really overwhelming. So bravo to you for being masterful enough in the sort of the editing and the selection of your sort of and how your information is sort of formatted as well.
Thank you, Sean. I also have to like credit the cast who were really helpful in the editing process too. Like we did a screening of an early cut of the film about a year before I finished it, and we just showed it to members of the cast and crew in Japan and got their feedback. So I learned a lot from that. Like there was this one scene I had included sort of like a small political flare up that happened around Pride in 2016. And I just thought it was an interesting story, but then they were like, the cast was telling me that, this is kind of old news at this point, and which makes sense because it's been a few years, but so I kind of wanted to like reflect how they were looking at their own culture in the final cut.
I mean, I think it's really great. So, I mean, you do have a lot of kind of principals in your film that you interview. How was it to get them to kind of like trust you to talk? Was it people more open to kind of talking and sort of sharing their experiences, or what? Did it take a little more of like a warming up with your subjects?
Yeah, sometimes it's really challenging to get people to talk, even if they're willing to be on camera. It just depends on the personality of the person. I think we were lucky to interview a lot of very strong personalities in the film, people who are kind of used to showing a public face and choosing their words carefully. So there are a lot of people who didn't really need much coaxing to open up to us. And I feel like with other people, it was more of a process of just letting the conversation flow and responding to the things that were making them interested or the subjects that they were passionate talking about within Japanese queer culture. Like, we didn't necessarily know going into each interview what was the thing that was going to be the most relevant to this person emotionally. So I think and in the trick of editing too, like if we did an hour-long conversation with someone, it was usually like the 5 minutes that they were most passionate about talking about something that made its way into the film, because it just like was the most compelling. And so I feel like that's kind of the method of just talking to somebody and trying to tease out what matters to them.
Oh, that's good. So for the folks that are joining us on Facebook, I am Sean Cotter. This is Kolbeins. We're talking about Queer Japan. Please type your questions into the field underneath the viewer. Those who've joined us, if you have questions as well, put them in the chat. We would love to sort of bring you into the conversation. I guess my next question, to being a total like fanboy and stan, Gengoro Tagame. I have such a huge affinity, crush, and also admiration for his sort of like representation of, he comes from a tradition sort of like Tom of Finland, but he has his own sort of twist, and I honestly feel like it's a lot more accessible, I guess, as a viewer of an erotic art. Like it, for some reason,
I think he's also like a lot more concerned with narrative than Tom of Finland was. Tom had some comics, but they were pretty like straightforward, like porn plotline type things. And Tagame Sensei, he's a prolific writer on top of being this like incredible draftsman and artist. So some of his stories are like 1,000 pages long and really get into intense character detail.
Yeah, I mean that's what I sort of really appreciate of it is too. Is like you can read a manga by him, and you can kind of get that sort of like he's a writer, whereas Tom of Finland is definitely more of a like an artist. Like I feel like he's almost like a photographer in many ways because it's like it's such a pin. It's sort of like a moment, and even though there is a comic, you know, like I said, he's not Tom of Finland is not necessarily a storyteller in a true sort of fleshed out narrative sort of way. Um, so, and
Yeah,
I think it's
he
great.
Tom of Finland comes from a background in advertising, so I feel like he was able to create all of these amazing iconic images that would like communicate a story to you at one glance. So maybe that's where his like storytelling lied, just sort of the way that we communicate stories and images through like advertising.
It's really great. So, and I like that he talked a lot about his sort of like his non-erotic project too, which is my brother's husband, which is really it's like so wonderful. Like I still have to read the second English part of it, but I devoured the first book because it was just so easy to read, and it was just like this is kind of a great sort of you know the same sort of canon, but like it, you know, de-eroticized for like public consumption, which is kind of a nice thing to sort of see people branch out in that sort of fashion.
Definitely, and that was the work that sort of helped him break through to the mainstream in Japan and abroad. You know, he received more critical and commercial recognition for making this G-rated family melodrama than he has spending like 30 years making intense erotic art. But you know, he really sees the importance of doing both and not ignoring his roots as an erotic artist.
Yeah, it's really great. So, can you maybe talk about like? I also appreciated too that you utilized your sort of screen. We had the Japanese captioning, and we also had a, a deaf LGBT person kind of speaking about their sort of experience as well. And as sort of a queer sort of cultural organization like we are, we're always looking to see to be as diverse and as inclusive as possible. Can you talk a little bit about your sort of like thoughts to be more inclusive? Because I feel like you hit like so many points of you know making this portrait of Japan as inclusive as possible.
Yeah, I was really grateful and lucky to meet Fuyumi Yamamoto, who's she runs Deaf Osaka LGBT Center, and she's just like this amazing activist and understands intersectionality in a really intense way. She has studied at Berkeley, I believe, or she's studied in California and then came back to Osaka and has this very like binational or international perspective and has had to fight for even just language to exist within Japanese Sign Language to communicate ideas like transgender and people's preferred pronouns. So she has really like done a lot for the deaf LGBT community and for, you know, both of those communities individually too. So I was glad we could share her story in the film. And actually, when we first screened Queer Japan, the premiere screening in Tokyo, we sent a version that just had English subtitles because that's what was requested, you know, for films in the festival. And a couple days before the screening, the festival contacted us and was like, "Hey, can we add Japanese subtitles?" And it was kind of too late. So we had a Japanese Sign Language interpreter in the audience. And still that wasn't really enough. So we heard feedback on Twitter from people in the deaf LGBT community in Japan that they didn't understand why the film wasn't subtitled for them. So we made sure that every subsequent screening in Japan and internationally has both English and Japanese subtitles, just to make it as accessible for everyone who's represented in the film, and hopefully as many audiences watching it as possible.
I know it's really hard, because we try to request for our, because we show a lot of international films, so subtitles are subtitles with that, but captioning is such a different animal in many ways, and I feel like, when we were kind of putting this year's festival together, it was really hard to get the captioning that we did. We've only gotten captioning for two films. Kind of like it's not enough in my perspective, because like I said, we want our festival to be as accessible as possible to as many parts of the community as we can. And I just want to give you props for like doing for sort of like going that extra step, because it is something that people are just starting to realize that it's something that's necessary, and it's nice when people just sort of do it.
Yeah, it's challenging too, like in a theatrical context, because like if someone's watching something at home, they can turn on the captions they need, hopefully if it's available for whatever they're watching. And then if it's showing in a theater, that's not an option. So we kind of just thought, like, once I started adding the Japanese subtitles to like the hard-coded cut that I was making, I was like, this actually kind of looks great compositionally. Like, I love the balance of having both English and Japanese text on the screen at the same time. And then, yeah, because it's written vertically, so it doesn't like crowd the screen the way that like two different horizontal subtitles would. And I think the film is a lot about language and translation and the way that words change and labels define us. So I kind of love the fact that there's kind of three different language systems going on at all times. There's like whatever language the person is speaking, and then two translations of it, because the Japanese subtitles are like necessarily a condensed version of the actual speech. Mm-hmm. So it kind of just like reflects how things change through translation while you're watching.
Yeah, I mean, it's so very important to make sure that like everyone can be involved in a screening as much as possible. So speaking of the language, kind of talk about the sort of the journey of like, because there's a lot of different terms that were kind of tossed about in the film, hentai being one of them, and also the sort of gender, oh my God, I'm losing my train of thought, but it was like the sort of gender dysphoria sort of syndrome.
Actually, yeah, that was a clinical diagnosis that used to exist in DSM-4. So now we're on DSM-5 for clinical diagnoses of mental health. And it's now, I believe it's now called gender dysphoria. And the old term was gender identity disorder. So in the Japanese news media in the early 2000s, thereabouts, gender identity disorder, the Japanese translation of that complex term, became like a well-known phrase and was used more frequently than words like transgender to reflect the gender identity of people that are basically trans. So unfortunately, it had like pros and cons for that formulation to be so widespread. So the pro was there were laws that were passed based on the need to provide services to people with gender identity disorder. However, since it was being medicalized and sort of problematized in that way, it was seen as this sort of like illness that these people have instead of just an identity. So activists like Tomato Hatakeno, who is seen in the film, and she's a video game writer, or she writes video game guidebooks and does like amazing activism. So she's been fighting for like, stop using that outdated term and just call us transgender.
I wanted to see more from her because I really loved her contributions to the film as well. Also
So I just wanted to say one scene I wish I could have included, but just we couldn't get the licensing for this. You see her playing the drums briefly in the film, and that's from this like jam band that she goes to on a regular basis, where she gets together with all these like mostly kind of like older straight businessmen guys, and they sing Queen and Deep Purple songs, and it's amazing. But yeah, we were never gonna get the license for like a Freddie Mercury song for this film.
So true. So maybe talk a little bit also like about like the sort of the evolution of hentai and hen, and how it sort of differs from gay, and how is it more, because I'm sort of like from the translations that you were sort of giving, it's more queer than gay. Maybe if you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, definitely like some queer theorists in Japan and outside of Japan have translated the word hentai to queer directly, but it's not necessarily like a one-to-one translation. Hentai directly translates to perverse and has, you know, it has a lot of different meanings. I feel like in America, most people who've heard the word hentai think of like erotic Japanese anime or manga with like bizarre elements like tentacles. And that's kind of like how the whole meaning of the word has come through in American culture. But in Japan, like it's more of just an adjective, like, oh, that's a weird person. And in the same way that we say like, isn't that queer or something. So certain people who don't mind having that maybe negatively, the term that might have a negative connotation applied to them have embraced it, while others find it really important to use words like gay that kind of like have an international political meaning now.
And to kind of go forth from the word hentai, your sort of exploration of Department H. I love that that was like sort of the center of your film. And could you talk a little bit more about, you know, what was it like being in that sort of in the club night, your sort of experiences? I'm sure there's like hours and hours of extra footage from there, because it just seemed kind of fabulous and amazing. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that as well.
I love Department H. It's a special place. I was lucky to be introduced to it the first weekend that I was in Japan to shoot the documentary. My producer, Hiromi Ida, she took me to Department H. She was like, you need to see this place. And she had made a short documentary about Margaret before, the host of Department H, the hostess. And it was blowing my mind. Like I couldn't believe all the amazing things that I was seeing, like all of these creative costumes that people were creating, and just how many different types of people were fitting together in this space for outsiders, basically, where any like kind of kink or cosplay, whatever you're into, is accepted and embraced in this space. And yeah, it was such a delight filming there and getting to know Margaret and Cyborg, whose performance art in Inflatable Pig was kind of the center of the whole night.
Was that an animal themed night? Like, because you know, we had the sort of the kind of furry dog sort of like, although they weren't furry, they were like rubber dogs. Sort of
latex, yeah.
I thought that was really amazing. So was that like the theme of the night that night?
Not exactly. It was just the annual like latex and rubber party that they have at Department H. And sometimes they have other themes, like I think April is like drag queen month, and then they do like they have all the little kaiju guys who fight, and sometimes that's featured more prominently. And actually, like, it's been amazing to see that party survive and carry on in the COVID era. Luckily, Japan has been able to keep its COVID cases pretty low. but they are taking social distancing and masks seriously at Department H. And they just had a party last month where Cyborg was like this latex ant, and she had like a mask on, and other people had gas masks, and or they were in bubbles. People were just like finding ways to turn PPE into a new kink, and it was amazing.
I mean, well, what a perfect like response. Because kink and a lot of times has a lot of masking anyways, and a lot of like sort of alter egos, altered bodies and stuff like that. It's just like I love and it reminded me a lot of like Club Kids in the 90s. It kind of had that kind of energy, but then it was like plus on top of it, because it was also like the sort of celebration of art, and also like a true celebration of real weirdness. Like I love the sort of moment with the person who is pushing the buttons at the elevator, and they have these really long like crazy like monster legs on. And I was just like, it just seems so fun. Like I was
Machie, she's great, and she was just so nonchalant about it. Like, never mentioned her monster legs, and then when we asked her, she's like, "Oh, these? I don't know. Like, the organizer bought them for me. I guess they came from a movie or something." But she's just amazing. And then in the after show of Department H, at 5 a.m. when it closes, a few people stick around, and Machie goes on stage and gets fisted. So we didn't include that in the film, but if you want to go explore it yourself, you should.
I would love to go, to be honest. It was funny because like the they kind of talked about the sort of her predilection for getting fisted, so which I thought was kind of, I was like, huh.
Yeah. When I watch that, sometimes I'm like, oh, I hope people don't think that this is like someone's just spilling the tea about their friend, but this is really just like what she does in public, so it's not a secret.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of had this sort of slightly dishy, but like also like it just sort of seemed like, well, this is what happens here at the same time.
Yeah, it's non-judgmental.
Yeah, I sort of love that, and that's what the space kind of felt like too, as you were sort of like wandering through. It didn't feel very judgmental at all. It felt like you actually did have that freedom to sort of be and create yourself, and that's kind of great. Like I wish there was more of that worldwide. I feel like people would be less hung up on.
I'm wearing a T-shirt of one of the other people from the Department H sequence. So Kumada Pusuke, he's the one who said like he was wearing a Zentai suit.
Oh yes.
So he's also a manga illustrator, and he drew this for Massive. It says work and then work.
That's great. Is that on the website?
We're basically like on permanent hiatus at the moment, so nothing's I don't think there's much for sale, if anything.
That's too bad. Massive, if anybody isn't familiar with it, it was a really great sort of like celebration of Japanese sort of manga art and culture, and hopefully it'll come back. So I guess kind of moving on from that too is like I really enjoyed the sort of there was a bit of focus on nightlife. You did go talk about lesbian spaces, especially the Goldfinger, and then also the party, the boyish
friend.
Yeah, boyish friend, which I think is such a great name for a party. But yeah, I mean, I think that like, especially right now, I feel like lesbian nightlife spots are like few and far between, and nightlife culture also in America is kind of like things are closing up, and I'm sure in the sort of pandemic as well, we're going to see it shrinking even more and more of spaces to gather. So can we talk a little bit about your sort of decision to choose a lot of the sort of the nightlife sort of spaces that where the queers of Japan kind of gather?
Yeah. So with Goldfinger, I was astonished to see a lesbian bar of that size and sort of like success going on because of what you just said. Like, there are so few spaces for lesbians in American nightlife anymore. I mean, there are parties, but so many bars have closed. I don't even know if there are many. Are there any specifically lesbian bars that you know of left in America?
I don't know what I mean. I can only speak of Boston, and Boston has none right now. There is parties that happen. At least pre-COVID there was. I'm not sure about after. And that'll be be interesting to see what happens and what comes of it after. But yeah, like lesbian nightlife is like non-existent.
So it was just like really heartening for me to see this thriving lesbian scene. And then, yeah, even beyond Goldfinger, there are other bars in that neighborhood that just cater to a lesbian clientele. And yeah, it's a great scene, but unfortunately, Chiga Ogawa, who runs the bar, has gotten herself into hot water several times with the trans community. So one of those incidents is depicted in the film. How at first there weren't there was like a no trans man policy at Goldfinger, and eventually that loosened, and she started a trans like a night for trans men, and brought them into the bar. So that changed, but then there was just another incident that happened last year where a, a woman who has transitioned and has her gender marker on her ID as female was not allowed into Goldfinger, and that created this whole sort of backlash against Goldfinger and Chiga, but she did eventually apologize and, has trans friends. So it's like, why does this keep happening? But I kind of feel like it's the same with like RuPaul or other people of that generation when you're like, how do you keep messing up on this trans issue? But yeah, it's important that a space for lesbians exists, but it should definitely include trans people. So that's just something that's been negotiated and trying to the community's been trying to sort those things out. And, now of course everything is on hold, and the fate of a lot of bars in Shinjuku Nichome is sort of up in the air. Luckily, like I said, a lot of places are still open because the COVID infection rate is low in Japan. So I think things have been able to sort of carry on a little bit more normally there in the nightlife.
How was it like since you kind of visited a few of the islands, Okinawa and stuff like that? How did the nightlife kind of like differ from Tokyo proper to the sort of the other sort of major cities that you went to?
Yeah, so I really enjoyed visiting Okinawa and seeing that there was this much smaller version of Shinjuku Nichome, which is a neighborhood that has, over 150 bars in it, all servicing the queer community. And in Okinawa, there were like maybe 15 bars. So it was what you would expect from a smaller sort of island city, like a fraction of something that's happening in the major metropolis. But there was definitely this more sort of community vibe of people like all knowing each other and coming together on a regular basis, and just like knowing if I go to the bar, I'm likely to see like a lot of my friends. It's a very small knit community. So I feel like there's it makes it more personal and intimate. The bartenders really know their customers, and it's just like it had a really fun party atmosphere from the places that I got to experience. So I was grateful for that, just to see what queer life is like in a different part of Japan.
One of my other sort of favorites and slight crush is I have a crush on Atsushi Masuda as well.
Yeah.
For years, and I just think he's really talented. So what was it like sort of like kind of like being in his space for a while? I mean, he's in such a like he went from like club, the being like almost like a club kid and doing performance in the club to sort of serious, sort of like a traditional Buto sort of like dance movement. Kind of maybe talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, Atsushi, he's this amazing dancer and just like very unique individual who I met back in 2014 at one of the parties that we threw for the release of the massive anthology in Tokyo. And he was just like tearing up the dance floor with his amazingness. And I had to meet this person because he just had so much like beauty and energy. And we became really good friends after that and have stayed in touch. And that was towards the beginning of when he was going full-time as a Buto dancer with Daidakudakan. And they're like this group that tours internationally. And it's kind of like the apex of Buto. If you're going to be in a group, it's like one of the top groups you can be in. So he is basically always rehearsing or performing. And we were like lucky to catch him a few times during the filming to be a part of the film. But yeah, it's kind of been liberating for him, I think, to go out of these like underground queer spaces and perform in these like highbrow theaters with a lot of other creative people, many of whom are queer. And yeah, he's just getting to like improve his artistry and reach that next level. So that's kind of where he's at, and I'm really excited to see him continue to evolve.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. You really kind of captured a certain sort of energy and vibe. I mean, he's very compelling as a character in your film. I'm assuming that everyone's seen the sort of final cut of it too. What were some of the reactions of the principal sort of like features of Queer Japan?
Yeah, it was really a pleasure to go to the screening in Tokyo and watch it with like 18 of the cast and crew there. And I feel like everyone had their own response to it, but it was just this collective moment where so many like prominent people in the community were in the same space and getting to enjoy this moment of celebration together. I think it was funny to hear Vivian Sato say when I first interviewed her, she thought that I was just like this anime fan who was collecting interesting people. And then when she saw the film, she like saw how it all came together and told a story that was like bigger than individual people. So that was cool. And like, I heard one of the most interesting things I heard from a person who worked at the bar where we had our after party. He was telling us, it was so interesting to see the community reflected in this way. And it kind of like had to be this international perspective and to be able to encapsulate it in a format like this. Because like if it was directed by someone in the community, they would just have different associations to the people that they're depicting and the history that they're showing. So I feel like it was kind of a strength, even though it was also a little bit strange to be like coming in from an outside perspective and having the burden of representation to do a good job telling other people's stories with different experiences than mine.
Well, yeah, I'm sure that's a hard sort of line to kind of cross too, because there is sort of always, especially with anybody from the outside, sort of imposing their sort of views and sort of where their sort of baggage into the sort of perspective that they're trying to capture.
Yeah, I just tried to like trust my collaborators and I worked with Anne, who's a Japanese and Korean American, a woman, and then Hiromi, who lives in Tokyo. And I feel like between the three of us, we were able to sort of look at things from different angles. And we always just tried to also trust our subjects and allow them to guide the interviews to tell the stories they wanted to tell.
That's good. So did you get a theatrical run in Japan?
We haven't yet. That was something we were talking about in the beginning of this year, and hopefully will come to pass. Yeah, I definitely would like to show it in some of the like art house theaters in Tokyo and around the country. So 2021.
So my last question for you is, this is sort of the question of the festival is, so in the midst of the pandemic, how are you finding sort of the lockdown and sort of the new sort of COVID reality kind of affecting your work? Are you sort of feeling creative, feeling blocked, sort of, how is the sort of the pandemic kind of treating you, kind of like either motivating or demotivating you to, as far as a filmmaker and an artist?
It's great. I'm just kidding. It's so many things. I feel like, yeah, it's definitely affected what I'm able to make as a filmmaker. I don't want to do things that put people at risk right now. So I'm not trying to like get a big group of people together to film something. I have been able to do a couple of like freelance documentary shoots for other people where I would go like shoot something from a distance. I've been like editing some things that I didn't have a chance to in the past. And I'm also screenwriting. So I'm kind of like just becoming internal. I'm like going into my interior. And yeah, I mean, I've been making some web videos too. Like I have a vlog on YouTube called Stretching with Kolbeins, where I just talk about things that are on my mind while I'm on a yoga mat. And it's pretty silly, but I'm kind of having fun playing with that and trying to do things that I can do with just like a camera and me.
I mean, I feel that that's really great. Like, because I mean, the sort of the lockdown is sort of an introvert's paradise in many ways. And I feel like, I'm glad that the sort of the festival sort of was put on pause, because it sort of allowed me to sort of have something to do and sort of be creative as well. Because I feel like, it's heavy. It's super heavy right now. And I feel like if we can sort of thrive and kind of come out of it, making art and sort of telling stories in any way that we can, I feel like that's so important to culture.
We're living through like really historical times. So I feel like the more people can be creative during these times, that work is going to be really important and valuable, because we're in this moment of transformation too. Like we need to be putting out good energy and like communicating important ideas and fighting for what's right, because everything is turning over and over and over. And maybe we're in like a societal collapse, but it's up to us to determine like where things go from here. So I feel like if we all use our voices however we can, hopefully we can have an impact culturally and societally. But yeah, it's also sometimes really hard to get yourself out of the feels and focus on something that can feel frivolous, like making art, but it's actually really important.
No, making sure that we give space to our voices and stories is so important. I'm of the ilk of like, let's tear it all down and build it new, because it's heavy. And it's also allowing, it's this kind of unprecedented time of reflection as well on sort of making sure that like, let's fix shit. Like it's like it's gone on too long.
Yeah. That's the inspiring thing about this moment. I think like it's the crisis, but we have the opportunity to change things, and hopefully we'll take it and not go down like an even deeper, darker path instead.
That's true. So any last words to our Wicked Queer audience about Queer Japan or yourself?
Just thank you all for watching the film, for watching this Q&A. I was really looking forward to visiting Boston for Wicked Queer, just to see some friends there and get, get some East Coast time in, but I probably won't get a chance to visit until next year or the year after, but I hope that I can come see the festival in physical form someday.
We would love you. We were looking forward to having you come and visit and hang out with us and spend some time in Boston. And so thank you so much for being part of the festival and also giving us your time for this Q&A. Folks, if you haven't seen Queer Japan yet, it is still streaming on Zerb TV. Go to wickedqueer.org for our full schedule and to get tickets. We are an all-volunteer organization. If you want to be involved with Wicked Queer in any capacity, find out more information also on the website, or if you want to donate, we would love a donation. So thank you everybody for tuning in, and thank you again, Graham, for your time. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, John. And viewers, if you want to follow Queer Japan, it's at Queer Japan on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And hopefully we'll have some news about the release before too long.
Yes, I hope so. And continued success with it.
Thank you so much, Sean. I really appreciate you.
I appreciate you too. Thank you. And thanks, everyone.